guess so.
Welcome everyone to Raechel Terry's Honors Defense in English and History. Once again, we have a student here who exemplifies the spirit of the honors program in interdisciplinary liberal arts research. And I also have the pleasure of, I'm the honors director and also serving on Raechel's board as well. And it's been a real pleasure working with her. She is a fantastic student. I've had her in a number of classes, and it's just been a wonderful pleasure. She's a beautiful writer, and I think you're in for a real treat with this presentation. She will be talking about Shakespeare's Macbeth through a historical lens of the succession of queens, which takes a really new look on the figure of Lady Macbeth. So this is very exciting. So without further ado, I will let Raechel carry on with her presentation.
Thank you. All right, hi everyone, and thank you for coming to my honors defense. So before I begin, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to the last week of women's history. It's actually not why I chose the date. I actually chose March 30th because it was the last possible date that I was allowed to present. But the coincidence is kind of funny because you're about to hear a lot about some extraordinary, historically important women, both real and fictional, over the course of this presentation. Okay, so before I really get into my research, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of my project. So my project is, as Dr. Hickok was saying, an in-depth character analysis of Lady Macbeth as a major political figure in Shakespeare's Macbeth. I studied her and looked at the play against the background of 16th century political culture in which Shakespeare lived and wrote, the succession crisis of Queen Elizabeth I's reign in particular. So I'd like to talk briefly about how I came to this idea. As an English and history double major, as Dr. Hickok pointed out, I was searching for a text that would lend itself well to both my historical and literary interests. One of my advisors, Dr. Martin, suggested Shakespeare because there's been a lot of new historical research done on it. And I started reading and researching and eventually settled on Macbeth because the play itself is loosely based on a historical event. So as I got into literature and studies on Macbeth, I realized that while there were already several historical approaches to the play, they all focused on the play's male characters. Lady Macbeth has been largely ignored in terms of her political significance, and this was surprising to me given the highly political nature of her role in the play. So I decided to focus my own research on this gap. So my approach to this project was pretty straightforward. I used this new historicism, or cultural poetics, which works perfectly with my majors and was just a natural fit for my topic. So using Stephen Greenblatt, who's pretty much known as the king of new historicism, as a model in his book Hamlet in Purgatory, I broke my project into two parts. So first, I established historical context by doing a lot of research on the period, and then noticing the connections between the political discourse of Shakespeare's lifetime and themes in Macbeth. I applied this research to my own analysis of Lady Macbeth. So now that I've kind of given you an overview of what my project is, I'd like to share my thesis with you, which I'm going to preface by reading the final paragraph of my introduction for my project. So during the 16th century, many European artists found support for their work through the patronage of their monarchs. Shakespeare was no exception and depended heavily on Queen Elizabeth and later King James for his livelihood. Reliant on the monarch's approval and the court's favor, Shakespeare would have been highly conscious of the political themes of his work and careful not to displease his benefactors. That Macbeth was written during a change in monarchs is significant to understanding its content. Would Shakespeare have altered the political substance of his play to fit the ideologies of a new ruler? James was quite adamant that he had assumed the English throne on the grounds of heredity. For the remainder of his reign, he promoted the opinion that a king's legitimacy lay in his bloodlines and took every chance he could to demonstrate the claims of his own genealogy. So the following is my thesis. Shakespeare experienced both the succession crisis of Elizabeth's reign and James's attempts to settle the questions it raised. Surely such prominent issues found their way into the playwright's work. Thus, whether or not he actually intended to use Lady Macbeth for political commentary close analysis of her character reveals a reflection of the ideas on monarchy and succession that emerged during Shakespeare's lifetime. As I worked through this project, I kept a few major questions in mind, and as I go through the rest of my presentation, I'd like you to keep them in mind as well. That way you can yell at me after if you don't feel like I answered them correctly. So the questions that I came up with are as follows. What were the defining aspects of the political culture during Shakespeare's lifetime? How might they have influenced the playwright's work? Does Lady Macbeth reflect this political culture? If so, how? And finally, what aspects of Lady Macbeth and the play in general, in relation to the historical context in which Macbeth was written, allow for this sort of reading? Along with these research questions, I'd like to just briefly highlight the major findings that came from my research. I'll get more in depth with them later, but I thought it would be nice to kind of condense them here so you can think about them as I go through. So these are the main points that I'm going to be going over and trying to defend today. First, Lady Macbeth is the driving force behind Macbeth's actions. Second, Lady Macbeth can be analyzed as a reflection of women in political positions during Shakespeare's lifetime. And third, Lady Macbeth can be further analyzed as a reflection of the Elizabethan succession crisis and the dynamic political discourse of the 16th century. Alright, so now that I've given you all kind of an overview of everything and a summary of my main points and my research questions, I'm going to talk about the historical context of the play, which was really important to my analysis of it. So I took a lot of time researching the political culture of the period and establishing historical context. There's a lot of information that I'm about to share, but I promise that it all ties into the play. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, what is particularly important to remember about Macbeth is the fact that it was written either shortly before or after the transition between the two monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I and King James. Shakespeare, like the rest of England at this time, would have been preparing for or adjusting to a new ruler. For both Elizabeth and James, the issues of succession and political legitimacy were extremely important. However, the two monarchs dealt with these issues in very different ways. As you will see in a moment, Elizabeth tried to avoid addressing the succession problem and spent more time establishing immediate power during her rule. James, on the other hand, who did not ascend to the throne through direct, heritable lines like Elizabeth had, spent much of his reign attempting to establish heredity as a fixed and agreed-upon method of succession. So Shakespeare would certainly have been aware of the conflicting ideologies of the two rulers. Furthermore, Queen Elizabeth and King James were not the only individuals to participate in the discussion on succession and political legitimacy that was occurring at this time. There were several other political and religious figures during the 16th century who offered their opinions on how succession to the throne ought to work. It was my goal to see how Shakespeare's Macbeth and his characterization of Lady Macbeth in particular fit into this discourse. Alright, so now that I've introduced you to the idea of a dynamic political discourse during Shakespeare's lifetime, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the different theories of succession that existed during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and Queen Elizabeth and King James, and how these theories were kind of established before their reigns and leading up to them. So, by Elizabeth's reign, there were already several theories on succession and how it ought to work. The idea of succession itself was central to English politics during the 16th and early 17th centuries, as the need for a fixed and certain rule of monarchical succession, whether grounded in an indefeasible hereditary right or left to an agreed form of election, proceeded from the larger need for political stability. And with Elizabeth's unwillingness to indicate an heir to the throne, it caused the topic to become more pressing than it might otherwise have been. Perhaps surprisingly, given the intense debate throughout Elizabeth's reign over who would succeed her, when she died, the transition from her rule to King James was accomplished with consummate ease, according to historian Howard Nair, or at least it was on the surface. Her cousin seemed the best choice politically. However, despite the relatively smooth transition to James after Elizabeth's death, there was no fixed rule of succession that dictated his ascension to the throne. There were several elements that influenced his selection as the next monarch, not simply his relation to the Tudor dynasty. Although heredity still played an important role in determining who could lay claim to the throne, other ideas like election, nomination, conquest, and prescription also played a part in the discourse on succession. So during both Elizabeth's and James' reigns, several political thinkers emerged to believe that the principles of hereditary succession were not enough to ensure England's political stability. Father Robert Parsons, a learned and outspoken Jesuit priest, encouraged the idea of parliamentary election in addition to heredity. Parsons promoted this radical mode of succession on the grounds that it would protect the kingdom against, quote, such unwanted monarchical prospects as those who might be physically, mentally, or morally defective, end quote. Naturally, this challenged old notions of heredity and its role in political legitimacy. However, even Parsons opposed instituting election as the sole means of determining the next monarch. The concept of election that developed during the 16th century was a system meant to exist alongside other means of selecting a ruler, not just by itself. The idea of nomination functioned in a similar manner. Also meant to ensure that the next in line was not physically, mentally, or morally defective, nomination proposed that the reigning monarch might be invested with the right, or even assume the right, to nominate a successor. So nomination had many supporters during Elizabeth's reign. A large number of her advisors and counselors encouraged her to name an heir once it became apparent that she would not provide one herself. Conquest served as another method of achieving political legitimacy and establishing succession at this time. However, the violence of political deposition was generally frowned upon by the time Elizabeth came to the throne. And her subjects feared that Elizabeth's refusal to deal with succession would eventually culminate in some sort of military struggle during her reign. The dynastic turmoil of the Wars of the Roses still haunted English political thought, and it was largely understood that an uncertain succession acted as an invitation to a dynastic settlement by force of arms. Although conquest had once proved a viable option for securing the throne, the majority of the population in 16th century England hoped to avoid it. Finally, there was the idea of prescription. A type of de facto rule, prescription referred to a right that would come into being with the passage of time. For example, James's claim to the crown demonstrated elements of prescriptive right. Although he was not a direct descendant of the Tudor line, he could trace several generations of ancestral connection to the English throne. Prescriptive right opened the door to collateral hereditary succession. However, this option faced opposition because it contained too many variables. Who would establish the proper extent of time to prove prescriptive right? And so, when James became King of England, no one was really certain of the rules that would allow for him to assume the crown. Although Queen Elizabeth's reign was a relatively stable period for England compared to the rules that preceded her, the political discourse concerning succession and legitimacy, as I've already said, was anything but static. The fact that she was a woman complicated matters still further. During her time on the throne, Elizabeth's refusal to marry and the unanswered question of who would inherit the crown after her death resulted in what has been dubbed the Elizabethan succession crisis. Anxiety was particularly high among her advisors and members of Parliament. So if I could, I would talk about Queen Elizabeth all day because I think she's awesome. She's so interesting. But I don't really have time for that, so I'm going to give you a few of the most relevant points about her that relate to my analysis of Macbeth. First, the issues of succession and legitimacy plagued Queen Elizabeth from the start of her reign. Elizabeth herself came to the throne not strictly by inheritance, but through King Henry VIII's third act of succession in 1544 in his final will. Her right to the throne was even further complicated by the fact that her father had earlier declared both Elizabeth and her sister Mary bastards and decided not to restore their legitimacy before placing them back in a succession. Because they had been legally bastardized by the 1536 Act of Succession, Henry VIII's will was necessary to ensure Elizabeth and Mary's place in the succession. Thus, the very beginning of Elizabeth's reign was colored by issues of legitimacy. Indeed, her own father's repeated marriages had all been in the pursuit of a male heir. When this failed, and Henry VIII's only son, Edward, died, and the crown passed after Mary I's reign to Elizabeth, the rather confusing nature of her accession brought both her own authority and who would come into power after her into question. So, aside from the issue of bastardy, Elizabeth had also had to contend with the obstacle of her sex. The new queen's femininity was, at the time, considered by many a disability, one almost severe enough to render her unfit to rule. Her sister had dealt with the same opposition, For as recently as the reign of Elizabeth's father, there was no rule that said that women could reign. So one of the issues with female rule was the common belief that it defied the teachings of Scripture. Women were thought both intellectually and morally weak, unqualified for the task of governance. Those who endorsed heredity above all other modes of inheritance, like Scottish legal writer Sir Thomas Craig, overlooked these imagined shortcomings in favor of dynastic succession. However, this did not stop Elizabeth's opponents from using gender as a platform for which to criticize her rule. As a result, such issues concerning her legitimacy deeply impacted how Elizabeth constructed her image as the rightful monarch of England. As queen, Elizabeth I faced opposition and criticism that a male ruler would not have. Although she tried to emulate her father's commanding presence, Elizabeth was frequently forced to depart from traditional masculine displays of power, such as physical strength, to assert her lawfulness as the ruler. So other important women at the time did not live up to the challenge of political powers quite so well as Elizabeth. And I have their pictures up here, likely Queen Mary I, who is pictured up on, I guess it's your right, top right. That's Queen Elizabeth's sister, Mary. And then Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Elizabeth's cousin and rival, pictured on the bottom there. And this is Elizabeth. So these women and the way that they led their political lives added to the anxiety, likely concerning female rule. Both of the Marys were disasters, and I'll talk more about them in a minute when I discuss Lady Macbeth. But the final and most important point about Queen Elizabeth's time on the throne, in relation to my analysis of Lady Macbeth, is the Elizabethan succession crisis, which I've already mentioned briefly. For the entirety of her reign, Elizabeth refused both to marry and to name a successor. So during the 16th century, the concepts of marriage and succession were inextricably entwined. And for the monarch, they were issues of public concern. Matrimony for the aristocracy was, aside from a practice used to secure political ties and economic benefits, the most common system of ensuring stable succession at this time. However, the fact that Elizabeth was a woman greatly complicated matters. In her study, The Quest for a King, Gender, Marriage, and Succession in Elizabethan England, historian Anne Glarin argues, during the early modern period, marriage assumed important ideological as well as dynastic significance. It was a model predicated upon the assumption that the head would be male. Elizabeth's sex disturbed this model in the fact that, as John Knox, a contemporary critic, argued, if she wed a foreigner, the realm would be transferred to strangers when the queen married, ceding to her husband, as her superior, the power that had been invested in her. Moreover, if Elizabeth married one of her own lords, she would have to deal with the internal jealousy that was almost certain to ensue. However, these outcomes were no more troubling to Elizabeth's advisors in Parliament than the prospect of an unsettled succession. Marriage and producing children were widely viewed as the surest ways to reconcile the question of who would come into power after Elizabeth. Thus, Elizabeth's accession of the throne and ensuing decision to remain unwed initiated a dynamic discourse on the nature of succession and what should be done to maintain political stability upon the Queen's death. So faced with proposals and requests from her advisors, and at times even demands from Parliament to address the succession issue, Elizabeth remained silent on the problem until she died. So what then allowed for King James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, to become King James I of England when Elizabeth passed away? By what right King James assumed the throne upon Elizabeth's death, regardless of how it appeared, has been a matter of debate among historians for years. Even the new Stuart king's contemporaries disagreed upon the grounds of his legitimacy. While the majority of English citizens concurred that James had been the most appropriate choice for ensuring the least amount of political conflict, because he was Protestant, not technically foreign, and connected to the Tudors, his coronation and subsequent rule provoked several questions on the nature of succession. Father Parsons was particularly outspoken about his misgivings over the legitimacy of James's claim to the English throne. Parsons knew about Robert Cecil, who was the Queen's most highly valued advisor at this time, and his involvement in James's accession. And in his book, A Conference About the Next Succession, Parsons revealed the lack of consistency in the rules that had allowed for this event to take place. Historian Peter Lake argues that it was Parsons' intention to create a sense of confusion and impending crisis by rendering the case for the apparently natural successor, James Stuart, less compelling than it might otherwise have been. Although James did possess the greatest hereditary claim to the English throne, Elizabeth's refusal to acknowledge him as her heir during her lifetime cast some doubt on his legitimacy. Furthermore, because it was likely that Robert Cecil played the most significant role in securing James's succession, old ideas of who held the power to appoint the next monarch were challenged. In response to these doubts, James spent much of his reign attempting to secure a fixed method of succession, insisting that he had come to the throne through heredity. Once in power, he ignored the many factors that had gone into his succession, and instead emphasized the one that best suited his absolutist theory of kingship. He took every opportunity to prove his relation to the Tudor dynasty and worked to ensure that his own successors would inherit the throne through heredity. Unlike Elizabeth, James was much concerned with the concept of an heir and wanted to guarantee that the next monarch came from his own direct line. Okay, so at this point, you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to the play. You're probably also wondering how I'm going to tie all of this information into an analysis of a single character, but it actually works really well. So many scholars and critics of Macbeth approach the play with its historical context in mind. Consequently, there's really no shortage of literature on the political nature of his work. However, most historical and political studies of Macbeth, as I've said already, focus on the title character, Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, who arguably functions as the driving force behind Macbeth's actions and features heavily in the play's commentary on succession, is largely ignored. This is perhaps surprising in light of the Elizabethan succession crisis and the fact that several women played significant political roles during Shakespeare's lifetime. Thus, while Macbeth has been frequently studied for its commentary on the nature of kingship and the qualities that give one the right to rule, a closer look at the character of Lady Macbeth and her role in the play suggests that perhaps she, not her husband, better demonstrates the volatile political environment of the 16th century. Okay, just to reiterate at this point, I'm just going to go over my main points again because this is the part of my analysis where I really get to them and try to support them. They are, once again, Lady Macbeth is the driving force behind Macbeth's actions. She is reflective of common anxiety over female political power, and most importantly, she is reflective of the Elizabethan succession crisis and competing views on succession and political legitimacy at the time. So now I'm going to go over each of these points more in depth and try to support them. But first, if you aren't familiar with the story of Macbeth, I'm just going to give you a very brief plot summary. So it's about a Scottish lord, Macbeth, who receives a prophecy that he will someday become king of Scotland. His wife, Lady Macbeth, upon learning of his prophecy, comes up with a plan to kill Duncan, who's the current king of Scotland at the time, so that her husband might take the throne. She persuades Macbeth to commit regicide, and in doing so, sets in motion a string of events that result in political turmoil. These events include the murder of Banquo, who poses a threat to Macbeth's claim to the throne, and forcing Malcolm, Duncan's son and heir, to flee to England. The chaos resolves only when Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are dead and the rightful heir, Malcolm, takes his place as king. So if you couldn't already tell from this analysis, Lady Macbeth's role in the political events of the play is very, very important. Perhaps even more so than Macbeth's. Especially at the beginning of the play, Lady Macbeth demonstrates a strength of will and ambition that overshadow her husband's more hesitant nature. As she herself puts it, Macbeth is too full of the milk of human kindness. Thus, it is she who must act, in a way, as the power behind the throne in order to achieve her political fantasies. The Lady Macbeth provides the fuel for her husband's ambition. Without her, it is unlikely that Macbeth would have pursued his desire to become king. Critic James Kirsch argues that Lady Macbeth has some doubts as to whether he is the man to fulfill such expectations. She knows that Macbeth has a conscience, that actions like those anticipated in the letter would throw him into profound conflict. Her constant manipulation and appeal to his masculinity force Macbeth to overcome his misgivings. Even he, at the beginning of the play, seems hesitant to replace hereditary succession with rule by military usurpation. He, like the majority of Shakespeare's contemporaries, dislikes the idea of regicide. It is Lady Macbeth who encourages this overthrow of political legitimacy. Tennenthouse argues that, at the outset of Macbeth, Shakespeare gives Lady Macbeth the very same elements which other Jacobean playwrights used to display the absolute power of the state. She, even more than Macbeth, demonstrates the qualities of a corrupt ruler. Ambitious to the point of recklessness, obsessive to the point of insanity, and shockingly cool at the thought of murder, Lady Macbeth is the ultimate tyrant. From this interpretation, it would seem that, for at least the first half of the play, Macbeth merely serves as a vehicle for obtaining the power that society refuses to allow Lady Macbeth to wield herself. So, as I have established, not only does Lady Macbeth act as a political force within the play itself, but her character and actions can also be connected to the political culture of Shakespeare's lifetime. One way to do this is by comparing her to actual female political characters of the 16th century. And the three that I chose to examine, as I talked about earlier, and who I thought were most applicable to the situation, were Mary Tudor, Mary Queen of Scots, and Queen Elizabeth I. One cannot help but notice the similarities between Lady Macbeth and female political figures of the 16th century. Like Mary Tudor, Lady Macbeth is typically viewed as ruthless and unstable. Mary's persecution of Protestant rebels earned her many enemies and the nickname Bloody Mary during her time on the throne. Although Lady Macbeth incites murder to dispose of political opponents rather than religious dissenters, her cruelty resembles common opinions of Mary I and her reign. Furthermore, toward the end of her rule, Mary began to display signs of both physical and mental decline, likely brought on by her inability to conceive and her husband's abandonment. Although brought to such a state for different reasons, Lady Macbeth's instability is comparable to Mary's. One common argument against female political power at the time was that women were prone to emotional volatility and fits of passion. As McLaren argues, one of the most widespread views of female rule was women's assumed propensity to become tyrannical, if not constrained in their exercise of political authority. While her own father, Henry VIII, had also been known for his changeable temperament and often harsh decisions, Mary I likely reinforced some of the reservations the English people held against female rule. Lady Macbeth, ambitious, merciless, and eventually overcome by madness, might be interpreted as a reflection of such doubts. Mary Stuart likely contributed to popular opinions on politically influential women during Shakespeare's lifetime as well. On several counts, the parallels between Mary Stuart and Lady Macbeth are striking. Mary Stuart was ambitious, hot-headed, and not particularly careful in her pursuit of power. Her demands for Queen Elizabeth to recognize her as the heir to the English crown were far from subtle and gained her many enemies. Eventually, her rash behavior and the unpopular marriage that forced her abdication of the Scottish throne put Mary Stuart in a situation of even greater desperation. Here, as her plotting turned to plans of dethroning Elizabeth in favor of herself, is Mary Stuart's greatest resemblance to Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth's reckless quest for power in the play involves both usurpation and assassination, schemes Mary Stuart was certainly familiar with. Just as Lady Macbeth allows the strength of her ambition to cloud her judgment in Macbeth, Mary Stuart put pride in the allure of power before her own safety. In the end, both women paid for such behavior with their lives. Mary Stuart was executed for her involvement in plots against Queen Elizabeth, and Lady Macbeth committed suicide to put an end to her guilt and paranoia. Although this ruthless ambition was also looked down upon in male political figures at the time, a female perpetrator made it all the more scandalous. With these comparisons in mind, it might at first seem an implausible argument that Lady Macbeth should reflect Queen Elizabeth in any substantial way. Elizabeth, while certainly ambitious, was cool, intelligent, and skillful in political negotiation. She did not allow her passions to get the better of her and ruled with careful moderation. Although firm when the need arose, she was neither cruel nor malicious. Furthermore, Queen Elizabeth never married. She acted of her own accord, not by manipulating a husband figure. Finally, Elizabeth inspired a good deal of popularity amongst her subjects for the better part of her reign. She was no tyrant to be hated. This picture contrasts sharply with Lady Macbeth's rash and immoral behavior. However, while Lady Macbeth might have resembled Mary I and Mary Stuart more in character and in situation, she parallels Queen Elizabeth in one important area, the issue of succession. Although Elizabeth's rule was later remembered as an era of growth and prosperity for England, her time on the throne was marred by increasing anxiety over who would replace her. Shakespearean critic Andrew Hadfield argues that it is not surprising that Shakespeare's plays written just before and after the death of Elizabeth consider the problem of the succession and the question of the legitimacy of the ruler. The question of succession was a constant factor in English political life throughout Elizabeth's reign. So ideas on succession and political legitimacy were already in flux by the time Elizabeth came to power, and both her gender and policies would act to raise new questions concerning these matters. These worries continued to occupy political thought long after her death. Perhaps then, the shifting ideologies of the 16th century that challenged and shaped its political culture were more important to Shakespeare's writing than individual political figures. So this leads into my final major point about Lady Macbeth, that she is reflective of the different competing views on succession and political legitimacy that circulated during Shakespeare's lifetime. So one way of approaching this is by comparing Lady Macbeth to other characters in the play. Whereas she and her husband represent a negative view of monarchical legitimacy through conquest, and perhaps even domination, given his encounter with the witches early on in the play, Banquo, Duncan, and Malcolm symbolize hereditary succession. What lends this even greater significance is the fact that Macbeth was performed for King James, and as historian Howard Nenner states, James Stuart claimed his English crown on the basis of hereditary right alone, and both his council and first parliament were willing, without exception, to endorse his view. Because James was so intent on establishing his right to rule through his bloodlines, the idea of hereditary succession became central to his political theories. Shakespeare was likely aware of this, and some scholars claim that he sought to please James with his commentary on succession and monarchical legitimacy in Macbeth. Indeed, the fact that James could boast descent from both the historical figures of Banquo and Duncan was no mere coincidence. By including these two characters in his play, Shakespeare not only validated James's authority as King of Scotland, but also endorsed his political ideology and claim to the English throne. However, nowhere in the play does the connection between Lady Macbeth's character and the political issues of succession and legitimacy make itself clearer than the famous scene in which she speaks of killing her own child. Lady Macbeth does this in the final moments of the play's first act, when she is about to confront her husband over his reluctance to murder Duncan. So, instead of having you guys listen to me read these lines out loud, because you're probably sick of hearing me talk, I'm going to show you a brief clip of them being performed by Marion Cotillard in the 2015 film version of Macbeth. And this clip is going to be followed by my analysis of the play. So.
I didn't do all that made me become a man.
And listen to her lines, not his. Sorry.
It has to do more, it's not.
What beast was that made you break this enterprise to me? When you just do it, then you're not alone. And to be more than what you were, you will be so much more than all. I have given son, and know how tender it is to love the mate that knows me. I would, when it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out had it so sworn as you have done to this.
If we should fail,
We fail. Screw your courage to the sticking race, and will not fail.
Alright, so hopefully you were able to hear what she was saying about the baby. That's the important part. So, okay. So, upon recognizing her husband's hesitancy, Lady Macbeth tells him that she would have killed their own son if she had so sworn as Macbeth had to murder Duncan. She urges him to remember his oath, claims that he is irrevocably bound by it. But why does Lady Macbeth use the analogy of killing her son to emphasize this point? Could she not have reminded Macbeth of his vow without reference to the deed? The child is mentioned at only one other occasion in the play, so why does he surface here? The majority of Shakespearean scholars interpret this speech as a critical moment for revealing the extent of Lady Macbeth's cruelty and the force of her ambition. Because the killing of her child is presented as an act even more terrible than regicide, Lady Macbeth not only speaks to the strength of Macbeth's oath, but also demonstrates how far she is willing to go in order to gain power. Shakespearean critic Janet Adelman, for example, suggests that Lady Macbeth expresses here not only the hardness she imagines to be male, not only her willingness to unmake the most essential maternal relationship, she expresses also a deep fantasy of Macbeth's utter vulnerability to her. However, such readings ignore the potential political subtext of this scene. Yet if we hold to the idea that this is a political play acutely concerned with the underlying issues of dynasty and political legitimacy that feature so prominently in 16th century England, this speech becomes essential to the development of these themes. Although Lady Macbeth's speech certainly speaks to her character and establishes the binding power of her husband's oath, it also reflects the deeply ingrained political anxieties of Shakespeare's culture. For not only is the killing of one's child portrayed as an act more deplorable than regicide in a moral sense, but also a political one. At this point in the play, the succession to the Scottish throne and thus Scotland's political stability has been utterly jeopardized by Lady Macbeth and her quest for power. It is my argument, then, that in these few lines, Shakespeare most explicitly reveals the political fears that plagued Queen Elizabeth's rule and prompted James's adamant belief in hereditary succession. In light of the Elizabethan succession crisis and the numerous ideas concerning kingship and legitimacy that emerged during the 16th century, it would seem that Lady Macbeth provides a negative image of non-hereditary modes of succession, particularly conquest. As Ninner states, conquest, whatever its earlier acceptability, was being viewed by the end of the 16th century as morally viable only for the purpose of deposing an acknowledged tyrant. In her attempt to establish political power based on conquest, Lady Macbeth discards genealogical right. By using the infant to demonstrate the strength of her convictions, she reveals her contempt for dynasty. With this understanding, Lady Macbeth's son becomes more than a mere babe. Rather, he is transformed into the most powerful symbol of succession in the entire play. By using the analogy of killing her own child to compel Macbeth to uphold his oath, Lady Macbeth rejects hereditary inheritance and alludes to the regicide she plans to commit. This scene is thus central to exposing why Lady Macbeth and Macbeth can never be the rightful rulers of Scotland. Because they are concerned more for immediate power than a fixed rule of succession, their reign brings only violence and turmoil. Shakespeare reveals by the end of the play that such power cannot endure. It is Malcolm, the rightful hereditary heir to the throne, who enjoys lasting authority and restores peace to Scotland by the end of the play. Finally, in Lady Macbeth, gender and politics are interrelated. To kind of wrap this up, to ignore one of these themes is to overlook the full significance of her character. Certainly, while Lady Macbeth and her attack on genealogy demonstrate the conflicting views on succession and political legitimacy that evolved during this period, she might also serve to comment on female political figures in general during Shakespeare's lifetime. As a negative depiction of women in positions of power, Lady Macbeth seems to reveal many of the reservations toward female rule that were present in 16th century culture. She also seems to allude to Queen Elizabeth's reign and the fact that she cares more for immediate power than for long-term succession. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir caused great anxiety among Parliament and her councillors. Perhaps these fears surface in the character of Lady Macbeth. On the other hand, her presence in the play, beyond even Macbeth, Banquo, or Duncan, or even Malcolm, validates King James's political theories and endorses his claim to the English throne. So, I hope I've addressed my questions and made your findings thoroughly throughout the presentation. Thank you all for coming and listening to me speak a lot. A special thank you goes out to my honors board, Dr. Bethany Haycock, Dr. Brian Rennie, and Dr. Russell Martin for helping me throughout the project and giving me advice. So the last couple of slides here are my works cited, and unless you have a burning desire for me to talk about them, I'll be open to any questions at this time.
Questions for Raechel?
So your depth and breadth of research is really impressive. What specific part of it was most enjoyable or interesting to you?
Well, I didn't really get a chance to talk about too much of this because it it wasn't quite as applicable as some of the research, but I really enjoyed reading about Queen Elizabeth. I mean, everyone knows about Queen Elizabeth I because she's a huge political figure for England, but I got to read some of her speeches and letters in here, and I just didn't realize how witty she was. She was so smart. It was really cool to like read her actual writing because I had never had that experience before. So, yeah. Questions for you?
So, given that James I was starting in 1604, not only king, but also Shakespeare's patron, because he then became head of the King's Men. He was the official head of the troop. Therefore, the patron for that was in close, they had a bond of favor with the king there. And therefore, it's in the king's interest, and Shakespeare's interest, to have things that make the king look good, right? Do you think that we could read Macbeth as Shakespeare's kind of roundabout way to diminish Elizabeth, and therefore justify the effort that James went to establish himself as the heir by actually equating Elizabeth in various ways, but not wholeheartedly, as a Lady Macbeth type, because she killed his mother. And plus, when James came to the throne, he had his own mother buried in Westminster Cathedral in a parallel chapel to Queen Elizabeth. So that gives them equal status. So, do you feel that this could be a kind of an attack on Elizabeth?
I think there's actually some readings that they definitely talk about how it was used to endorse King James, but I didn't really get into too much about how it might have been used to diminish Elizabeth's reign. I definitely think you could do that, though, just comparisons with the succession crisis. You could probably go from there. But definitely highly endorsed King James by including Banquo and Duncan, who James could trace his lineage back to as the heroes of this play. Heroes. And yeah, I think you definitely do something with that. I don't know how far you want to go with comparing her directly to Queen Elizabeth, just because he owed a lot to Queen Elizabeth, so I'm not sure if you could make that stretch too much.
Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare owed a lot to her, but
Although she's gone.
that is
so.
true. Yeah. But definitely endorsing James, but I didn't really get into anything like her trying to diminish Queen Elizabeth's reign. You can probably do that though.
I see a little opportunism in Shakespeare
Yeah.
here to redirect.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, there's actually a whole book on the transition between his play that I read for this, between James, like his work after James and his work with Elizabeth before James, and how transition themes. It's interesting. Yes.
Raechel, I do have a burning desire to see your sources.
Yes. Okay.
I was just curious
Okay.
what primary sources you use, because you said the Elizabeth's writings weren't that directly relevant.
I looked at some of her responses to Parliament, because I went a lot more in depth with like the marriage and succession thing during her reign in my historical approach to it. They didn't include all of that here, but I did look at some of her direct responses to Parliament when they asked her to marry or name a successor, and how she would keep deferring these requests. And I also, two of the most important documents that I looked at were actually written by King James himself, which was True Law and the Basilica of Durand, which were political tracts that he had written actually previous to his reign in England, while he was still only the ruler of Scotland, which kind of established his divine rights of kings theory and his idea of hereditary succession. How he thought that should be the primary fixed method of succession. So those are some really important ones, aside from the sites. Yes.
can't help thinking back to our discussions of Medea and
Yeah.
killing of children. And I was thinking about your comparison with, Queen Elizabeth and Lady Macbeth. Is there, and you admire Queen Elizabeth so much, is there something that we need to admire about Lady Macbeth, and even in the evil that she does?
I think so. I think she definitely, there's been a lot, I didn't really focus too much on the feminist discussion of her. I did include a little bit of it in my paper, but there's a lot of work that talks about how she was trying to use the methods that were available to her at the time to attain a position of power, which was through men, through manipulation, like the power behind the throne. She couldn't really directly get it. So she was trying to move through other people like Macbeth to find herself in a position of power. And I think that just the fact that she has that ambition, we can admire in her.
You like?
Well, not particularly. I think I don't know. I think I like her. She does show remorse toward the end of the play. She goes bad from all of this and eventually kills herself. So I think there's potential for admiration, but I don't really like her. Yes.
Since you mentioned the question of indirect political power, I'm wondering if you could read the character of Lady Macbeth as, in the context of this succession question, as maybe anxieties about the role of the spouses of rulers in the process or in the discussion at all.
Yeah, I think you could definitely do that. I know when I first started doing this research, I was going to focus solely on women in positions of power, kind of expanded from there. Then there was a lot of discussion about different women at the time who were like acting as regents for either like male children, or who hadn't like grown to the throne yet. And there's also discussion about kind of the opposite side, I guess. When there's a female ruler at this time, she marries a foreigner, the power is going to be transferred to the male, and they had anxiety about that at the time, definitely about having a foreign rule coming in and taking power if there was a female leader. Yes.
So Rachel, maybe a two-part question depending upon what the answer to the first part is. You've combined some historical analysis with some literary analysis. What do you see as